Hello everyone. I have two school stories to read for you today. One from the perspective of a student, and the other from the perspective of a teacher. Please enjoy. The following story has elements of sexual harassment. From the start, this man was overly nice. Like, I'm talking in your face nice. He offered constant help for physics problems from the start and would watch over your shoulder for minutes at a time, which a lot of people in my class liked. Now, I usually wouldn't say this, but for the purpose of why I felt uncomfortable in this class, I'm stating that I've always had a bigger butt naturally, and was unfortunately standing in the aisle, aka this teacher stared right at my butt every day. And when I leaned on the lab counter, my butt was out more. Embarrassing to write as a detail, but it makes sense once you read through. I'm not even gonna hide it. I felt like I had to succeed for this super nice teacher who was extremely dorky and charismatic, and just a super awesome teacher at first. I really enjoyed physics because of him, even though I sucked at the subject. For the first part of the year, he was super nice and always hung around my lab table with my friends and I, but mainly spoke to me. He even jokingly assigned me to read this book or I wouldn't pass my final, since I complained about how hard writing was for me at the time with depression, except I left out the depression part. There's just a certain boundary that I couldn't cross over with teachers, taking a few exceptions like teachers I felt really close personal bonds thanks to having a healthy teacher-student relationship. This teacher and I, as nice as he was, never hit that level of teacher-student relationship, so I never told him anything about my personal life. Speaking of my personal life, my parents were in the process of separating throughout my junior year, and so if some of my behavior seems a bit harsh or snappy, then know I was going through a lot at this time. In October, a huge event rocked my family and I skipped school for 2 days. My physics teacher offered to help me with the material I missed, and I went in for extra help. Let me say now that I had about 5 emotional breakdowns within the 2 days following this mass event. One I will not be sharing, so I was just drained and wanted to move on and learn. My teacher tried to be funny and charismatic as always, and when I wasn't even cracking a smile, he got angry toward me and asked,
"Why the fuck aren't you laughing?"
I ended up telling my dad what my teacher said to me that afternoon, very mortified, and he called the school and reported it. Afterwards, his whole demeanor shifted from lighthearted to just stony and cool whenever I tried to speak to him. He eventually warmed up again, done with his tantrum from being ratted out, and became the teacher I met at the beginning of the year. The week before, he really honed in on me, helping me, specifically since I had a lot of trouble with all the math and formulas, and invited me for an extra help session again. I hadn't gone to one since he had gotten vulgar with me, but my grade depended on it, so I went unwillingly. He tried pulling the same nonsense again, but this time I forced out laughs so he could just get through the lesson and I could go home. About 20 minutes into the plan, he grabbed my wrist suddenly. He just kept explaining the material to me, but his hand had my wrist in a death grip. I should also say that I was in an abusive relationship when I was 14 and my abuser grabbed my wrist on multiple occasions to physically intimidate me, so this action had me really panicked, which my teacher noticed but ignored. 10 minutes later, his hand slid from my wrist to hold my hand, and this is where I drew the line. I yanked my hand out of his grasp and told him in my calmest voice that this was not professional and I did not feel comfortable with him acting like this. He just rolled his eyes and said,
"Grow the fuck up."
Again, I reported it to my mom, who told the school. In February, my family went through another emergency and I took off school for another 2 days. I was fully emotionally drained by the time I went back, spent on the breakdowns and the like, and my teacher had calmed down again after being ratted out by me and now more students. He helped me get back on with the lessons, but he tried to pry about what happened with my family, even asking my guidance counselor for information as to why I was put into a group therapy for a bit. My counselor notified me and my parents. My parents finally started to give the school hell about replacing this teacher. My vice principal offered to switch me into another class, but by this point it was April, so I said I'd just stick around. And this is also around the time when the allegations spread like wildfire that he was going to be fired for porn being found on his personal Twitter account. Luckily not underage porn, but nonetheless porn, and students found it before an administration could. The year passed by more, with students reporting him for behavior more and more, and he announced in May that he'd be quitting this year since there were always a few bad apples, in his own words. He stared down a few people in the class in particular, and I was one of them. After this, he was entirely unhinged. He made rude remarks constantly in class, and didn't help me at all with subjects. I ended up catching mono and was out for 3 weeks. When I came back, he tried giving me about 3 tests in 1 week, which I told him I couldn't take, since I missed the entire lesson. His response?
Grow the fuck up and take the damn tests. Stop making fucking excuses. I'm not shielding you from this shit for much longer.
Let me restate. I was out for 3 weeks with mono, bedridden with fevers that were constantly above 101 degrees, and in the hospital at one point since I'd caught pneumonia. There was no way I'd be taking these tests. He ended up voiding all of my exams after a meeting with my guidance counselor and parents, plus my vice principal. My parents and counselor also notified the vice principal that the teacher was making inappropriate remarks to me in class. And this was starting to include comments on my butt. He blatantly stared at my butt in class and got too close to me, enough that his leg leaned on my butt. As the year died down, he began to really peak in his creepiness levels. Aside from now the regular butt comment about how nice I looked in my leggings or shorts, he also began to talk heavily of sex in front of me and my lab table. He told us practically that college is all about getting laid, and that physics won't matter in the end. He then winked at me and asked if I could stay after class in my ear. When I said no, he cursed me off under his breath and left. Again, I'm also a survivor of an abusive relationship, so this behavior was setting off all alarm bells in my head. In the last week of school before finals, we made bottle rockets to send off for fun. My teacher calmed down on the inappropriate remarks enough, and I felt a bit less on edge. But of course, it was too good to be true. As we were all walking to the fields to shoot off the rockets, my friend and I were talking about this guy who later on became my boyfriend of 3 months before breaking up, but that's not a story to tell. He overheard and then went on a huge tangent about how relationships now don't mean a thing. He then looked me right in the eyes and said in a tone that will forever stick with me,
You will get fucked very soon.
I told him to please leave me alone, and I threatened to call the police for what he said, even though I had no idea if it would work or not. He just laughed and walked ahead, and I ended up in guidance for the rest of the day, completely distraught. I took my final in guidance with permission from my vice principal and never saw him again. I'll never forget how this teacher, this asshole who was somehow allowed to teach, spoke to a student. He should have been on a predator list for how he spoke of sex so vividly in front of minors, and I have yet to see him since. So to my ex-physics teacher that constantly had to make sexual remarks, I hope one day that you rot in jail. And for those wondering, he failed me for my final, and failed a few other kids in class as well that he was known to have problems with. For the other students, he gave them all A's. My worst student was first institutionalized at age 4. Reading his file was like reading the biography of a serial killer. He killed the family pet. He tried setting his mom's bed on fire while she was in it. He had violent fits of rage and heard voices in his head that weren't there. He had been diagnosed with mental disorders that I have never even heard of. There were at least 4 or maybe 5 mental conditions listed within his file. By the time he made it to my class, he had been removed from our school twice and placed in the most restrictive setting in our school district. And both times parents pitched a fit and threatened to file a lawsuit if he did not return to our school. On the first day of school, while he was in my class, he graphically explained how sex works to one of our younger students. We had a parent conference on the 3rd day of school so that everyone could get acquainted. When we brought it up to the parents, the dad got super defensive and tried to explain away how his son would know so much about sex. It was a huge red flag. The kid was not allowed into the boys' bathroom with the other boys. This stemmed from an incident right before he left us the second time. The actual details never made it into his file, and no one would really say what exactly happened, but you can guess. While he was in my class, he would do anything to get out of doing work. He quickly figured out how to game the system. He realized that if he caused a big enough disruption, then we would have no choice but to take him out of the room. Sometimes this disruption would be him crying and screaming at the top of his lungs. Other times it would be him peeing and pooping his pants. One time we had to get the other students out of the room so he wouldn't hurt them. We had to move furniture away from him so that he wouldn't throw it at us. Part of his positive behavior plan included time to journal. He would write some of the most violent and disgusting stories. Often the stories were about him hurting other children and needing to be punished. He was obsessed with death and violence. I kept one of the little booklets he made, and it's around here somewhere. But he was obsessed with Five Nights at Freddy's, and many of his stories incorporated those characters. He would write about burning children alive. Worst of all, the parents would take his medicine for themselves. We never had any definitive proof that this was happening, but I'd be willing to bet a lot of money on it. The mother did say that the psychologist he was going to said to take him off of his antipsychotic medicine to see if we would notice any changes. Needless to say, we noticed. When he was medicated, he was somewhat manageable. However, when he was off his meds, he was completely and totally unpredictable. Eventually, my co-teacher and I had enough, and we pretty much harassed his mother every single day until she called an IEP meeting. He went on a modified day schedule so that he left at noon every school day. She finally put them on the online school program that the state offers. The last time I saw him, he came up to me, gave me a big hug, and asked if I knew that there were glass houses on the dark side of the moon where a bunch of people lived. They moved him to another school district. He was 9 years old while in my class. He'd be about 12 now. His very dysfunctional parents divorced not too long ago, and the last I heard, he had gained a lot of weight. I'm assuming that the massive weight gain comes from the side effects of the antipsychotic medication. Hopefully that means he's taking it. I have no doubts that this kid will go on to kill someone either for fun or just to see what it's like. There are so many details that I've left out and have forgotten. I could talk for hours about this kid. However, there is one day I'll never forget. He was playing with his toy that he brought from home, and I reached over and took it off of his desk. He first looked at my hand, and then looked me straight in the eye. It was at that moment I realized that he really wanted to hurt me. He threw his head down and cried on the desk like he normally did. Only a few minutes later did I look over and hear him still crying, but he's looking straight at me with no tears in his eyes, and he had the most psychotic and evil-looking grin on his face, all the while still making sobbing sounds. It was the only time I had ever been afraid of a student in my career.